So I want to provide a little bit of background, both on the panel and what we're trying to do, and we'll kind of go through. But first, what I'd like to do is I'd like to do some introductions. I'm going to do some then opening statements. I will link I'm not here actually talking about our book, but I'm going to use some of our opening statements to be a framing around it. And this panel definitely is on the topic we're addressing, which is value, which has been a theme coming through the day so far. So I'm going to probably just go from my right to left here. So Katrine Bosley has had the pleasure of actually growing, leading, and successfully taking several companies, is now entering an emerging area of doing genetic-based therapies. And I'm going to let you, when you start doing some of your comments, say a bit more about that. And as one of those areas, this is transformative on certain disease states, but also challenging of some of the ways that we've traditionally sought reimbursement. John Glasspool has been a colleague of mine when we were at Novartis and through years and across different companies and venues, and is at Baxalta, which had a rapid emergence within the Boston area and rapid changes in the status in the area. And so I think also will speak quite well. And then Peter Newman and I have been part of the value series that MassBio has done here, and then Peter's been very active in the community from Tufts. And I think as somebody who has published, thought, and put structured approaches around this notion of value, I think we're going to kind of ask him to kick off the panel thoughts. Before we do that, I want to provide a little bit about, I'm not actually an individual that writes books. In fact, I've never written another book, and it's not clear. I was telling Peter, it's not clear to me I'll write another book. Just having been through the process, I think nice blog seems to probably be what I would probably target. But one of the reasons why we did it was based on the amount and level of change we were seeing. So I want to give you an example. We were doing work in Sweden, and it's still an area where I'm continuing to be active, and we were in a therapeutic area that I probably won't get specific to, but we were working with Karolinska and actually working with their payer community there, Stockholm County, and that Stockholm County is basically the health authority of that particular region, and Karolinska was rebuilding one of their hospitals in Solna, and the Solna facility, as it was coming online, was actually going to have smaller bed capacity, smaller physical capacity, less OR activities, fewer beds, even though the population base of Stockholm was going up considerably, and it was replacing a hospital that was much larger, and it actually had an annual growth rate of about 9% demand on healthcare services over the period of time, and forecasted for the future as a result of immigration into Europe and a variety of forces that are in the news, as well as aging populations. And the reason why they did that is that Stockholm County Council was through the process of going therapeutic by therapeutic area and converting them over to value-based reimbursement. And what value-based reimbursement was, they didn't want them to focus on therapeutic interventions. They actually wanted them to focus on health status of a population and actually avoiding therapeutic interventions and progressing that entire population to a healthier status. And so it actually meant by taking those that were the sickest and highest need patients and looking for a differentiated approach to doing it, and then it actually was changing the curve and shifting the entire curve to the left. The reason why they reduced capacity was that they actually wanted that to be done more efficiently, effectively. In fact, they wanted it done not in health facilities. And in fact, they were emphasizing use of technological approaches where patients would actually have infrastructure that surrounded them wherever they were, including in their own homes. We actually had a panel about 2 weeks ago over at the MIT Media Lab, and we had the pleasure of having a variety of people here kind of from the Boston area, you know, Blue Cross Blue Shield, some folks from Optum Health, Population Health Management, head from Partners Healthcare, and others. So we were intentionally trying to kind of cover different people from provider, et cetera. And we actually asked them and said, what's the one major critical investment area you're looking at, and why are you looking at that? And they universally said through their venture funds and through other things, it was actually enabling the ability to deliver care to populations, but not in our facilities. And in fact, they actually indicated they were making major investments in every form of possible remote infrastructure engagement and relationship that was not facilities-based. And that in fact, that was a key requirement for them to actually be able to hit any of the health status targets that they actually had going out there. I actually did not know that was going to be the answer when we asked the question when it came up, that would emerge as of some of the significance that was on that. So when this notion of value came up, and again, when we started taking a look at, everybody talks about healthcare reform, et cetera, but what we don't see in healthcare reform is the United States. We've just got finished doing work with about 40 of the major health system CEOs and their executive teams, and one thing that came back is they said, we're all going to acquire each other, we're going to end up with 100 large health systems in the United States, and most of those are actually going to have their own plans. And most of those are not just going to be delivering the care, they're going to be writing the contract to actually deliver the sort of the financing of that care as well as the delivery of the care, which actually meant they may become sort of a next generation Kaiser type model of completely integrated between, which actually meant their responsibility was the patient. In fact, they chastised us because I asked about patient engagement models. They said, we don't use the word patient, we're trying to think about it as consumers and individuals who may happen to have disease states. And we work with them on those disease states, but we're actually there to think about their health status because that's the only way we can shape and transform. So what we came away with on all that is we kind of said therapeutics, whether it's a device or diagnostic or biological or chemical entity, now goes into a system where you're seeing different responsibilities and different obligations and different modes of what people are trying to do. So the value that people are trying to say is, can you help me with the disease state of my patients, but can you also, what kind of contributions are you making to our ability to actually transform a population at the same time? In fact, we found in the negotiations, people beginning to kind of say, if the therapy in and to itself can't deliver the outcome, and if patients are outside of those facilities, what delivers the outcome that actually drives that area? And I want to spend just kind of one more second on that notion, because if I take a diabetes patient, they're only actually in front of a health facility 4% of the time they're managing the disease state. And so if the outcome is actually, so the therapy clearly, the anti-diabetic therapeutics clearly contributes, but 96% of the time that disease state is being managed, it's not with a clinician in front of a clinical community. And so you could also take a look at something like, some of you may know this, there's a prescribed app from WellDoc called Blue Star, which actually is FDA approved and prescribed, which actually has an A1C benefit comparable to certain anti-diabetic therapeutics. So you sit there, and we kind of pulled back from all this, and we kind of said, okay, so we have this move towards value, and value here is actually an assurance of an outcome. Value is kind of sort of confidence, and it actually may even be changing and transforming a population of patients. And that's actually where that's becoming the mandate of both European, US, and actually increasingly even Asian healthcare systems. The therapy is clearly, therapeutics, I've spent my life in different ways in the community, is clearly kind of part of it, but it may be a necessary but not always sufficient part of what it may take to do that. So what does that bring as kind of a challenge? What does that bring as part of like how one actually gets to an outcome, and whose responsibility is that? Because in a way, this begins to shift into an area where it's not actually where healthcare providers always spend their time, and they actually may not even have the infrastructure and capabilities as they transform the footprint of physically how they're going to be operating. And it's actually not necessarily where life sciences companies or a pharma or a biopharma typically saw its responsibility to play. And there were significant gaps necessary to achieve that value, but actually we were accelerating there at an accelerating rate. So I want to do that as a bit of context, and actually I'm going to now hand that over to Peter, because I think this notion of what value is, we're going to declaratively say it can't be about cost, because we're actually spending too much, and there's too much here. It's not about cost, but it is actually about how you quantify and think about value, but also it can't be talking about value, because you're going into a system where the individual who's making the clinical decision actually is also increasingly bearing the financial risk for the outcome of that clinical decision. And whether or not, that is a direction everything is going, and we don't see any way that's going to reverse for a lot of reasons, both structural, governmental, new organizations, even how companies are starting to contract for healthcare services. So if that's the case, can we get terms around it, and how do we organize around it, and what are some of the implications for us and our industry around that? So Peter, let me turn over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff, and congratulations on your book. And I want to thank MassBio for inviting me and for all the great work that you're doing. So value is a broad concept, and I want to build on some of Jeff's comments. And specifically, though, we can talk about value in the system. I want to start by talking about what are sometimes being called drug value frameworks. And my colleague Josh Cohen and I had a piece a couple of months ago in the New England Journal where we compared 5 drug value frameworks. And in fact, some of these frameworks are broader than drugs, but all of them look at drugs. So we looked at, and you may have seen these as well, frameworks from one, the American College of Cardiology, American Heart Association, 2, ASCO, the American Society of Clinical Oncologists, 3, ICER, that's the Institute for Clinical and Economic Research, a new institute that's evaluating drugs in other areas of medicine, 4, Memorial Sloan Kettering, they have something called the Drug Abacus, and 5, NCCN, known for its cancer guidelines, but now also advancing these value frameworks. So if you look across these value frameworks, there are similarities and differences. There's differences in the dimensions they look at value and how they weight the dimensions, in the intended audience, in the extent to which they use formal cost effectiveness. But I want to make 4 main points about these. One, in a sort of overriding point, these are value-based, and as Jeff said, not cost-based. Now, in a sense, that's obvious. Of course, they're value-based. They're value-based frameworks. But what it means is really, in some sense, profound, that we're going to use information on value to price and to make decisions on products. A lot of the discussion around drug prices has turned on high R&D costs, with the justification for high drug prices often being, and you've seen these numbers, that it takes $2.6 billion on average to bring a drug to market and so forth. In a sense, the value-based frameworks turn it on its head and say, at least in some sense, those numbers are irrelevant, that all of the great R&D that you're doing, it's important and we admire you for it, but we're not going to price based on it. And in fact, if we do price based on it, we're just giving incentives, in a sense, to keep increasing those R&D costs. If we want to send the right signals to the researchers, the manufacturers, the developers, value-based pricing is the way to do it. And of course, value-based pricing has the great advantage of we're going to pay based on, ideally, outcomes achieved, what people care about, and so forth. So point 1, value-based pricing is this, in a way, profound shift. And by the way, it's the way we price almost all goods and services in our marketplace. When you go into the auto dealer to buy a car, you don't go up to them and say, how much did it cost you to build that car? Nor do they say, you got to pay a lot for this because our R&D costs were so high. You pay based on the features and the competitors and the alternatives, but you're really basing your decision largely, if not wholly, on value. Now, of course, pharmaceutical markets are different. There may be good reasons why we want to subsidize R&D costs. We might want to do other things in terms of looking at costs. But again, the value-based frameworks are it's sort of saying that's not important. So point 1, the value-based. Secondly, all of these frameworks I mentioned are coming from the private sector. And in a sense, they're coming from the private sector precisely because the government, at least in the U.S., has been absent from this kind of initiative. In other countries, this would be, and in fact is, a government-run exercise. In the UK with NICE, and in Germany, France, and other countries, the government evaluates value. Because of the reluctance of U.S. policymakers and the politics of this to do that, in particular the inability of Medicare to negotiate prices and so forth, the private sector has stepped in. In a way, it's a kind of uniquely American approach. Now, many people would argue this actually has some very desirable features. They're sort of decentralized, they're experimenting in their own ways, they have sort of incentives to be innovative and to advance their own initiatives, but these are privately advanced. So that's point 2. Point 3, there are enormous analytic challenges to measuring value, and John is going to talk about some, maybe we'll hear more later as well from others. How do you measure value? Of course, whose value are we talking about? Ultimately, we'd like to think about the patient's value, but the decision makers are often the payers, the physicians, the employers, and so forth? How do they think about value? The families, the caregivers. What dimensions of value are we going to measure? The different frameworks come at this differently. All of them look at clinical benefits, but some of them weight the clinical benefits alongside other benefits, toxicity and sort of convenience and other attributes, but they do it differently. And again, how do you weight these dimensions? How do you combine the dimensions? Do you come up with a single number to come up with a value-based sort of score? ASCO gives you a score for your cancer drug. ICER gives you a sort of price that comes out of their framework. Some of the frameworks don't come up with a single score. They leave it sort of disaggregated. So that's the third point. Fourth point, there's a big distinction between value and affordability. And sometimes these are conflated. So value means what we're getting for what we're paying, in a sense for a unit, but for a drug or a procedure. Affordability means there's something about the total spend. And again, and we can come back to this, most of the frameworks ignore budget impact. The ICER framework actually has a very serious sort of set of analyses that go into the budget impact analysis alongside a cost effectiveness analysis to get you at what they consider a fair or more reasonable price. So those are the 4 points I'd like to leave you with. Value, not cost, private sector, the analytic challenges, and let's think differently about value and budget impact. And very quickly, I'll leave you with 2 other thoughts. One, what is the implication for all of you? Well, certainly we need to think about value early in the development process. We need to think about value in the whole life cycle in terms of analyses we can do, real-world data, modeling, post-launch analyses, and so forth. And finally, just a quick word on innovative contracting, which I know we've been hearing about from others, which I think is very much a part of this value story. I have, in writing over the years, been a bit pessimistic on our ability to truly pay for outcomes, because I think we have been overconfident in a way of our ability to do that, and there's a whole series of reasons why it's actually hard to do. But I think we are getting ourselves there. And I think we are entering a period where we can do more in the future. So I'll just stop there. Thank you, and look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you very much for your attendance, and thank you for the invite from MassBio for this presentation. Peter's really walked you through the questions around value. I'm going to take a step back and talk about at Baxholder, how do we think about value? How do we think about value, and how does that impact what we do from a development perspective? So many of you will have seen presentations from me and others at Baxholder that we're very much combining what do we know about biology and what do we understand about patient need. And that really centers us on how we think about and how we construct our value frameworks. So essentially, if you imagine the rings of your eye, at the center of the eye is really what we say is what is the patient unmet need. And we don't talk about the broad disease unmet need. We talk about a specific subgroup or stratified group of patients. So for example, if we were looking at lipids, we don't look at everybody with a lipid issue. What is the subpopulation that we think has a particular need that we're addressing? It's very important because the epidemiology and the actual value gap is going to be very different for different subgroups. So the center is what is the patient unmet need and the subgroup of that patient unmet need. The next key thing that we're assessing is what is the standard of care for that particular patient. And the way we think about that at Baxholder is we start with patient-centered drug design. Can we use patient-centered drug design to really inform us of the unmet need, the measures of unmet need that may not be directly linked to the disease. So for example, in MS, what is the burden of fatigue? Can we quantify and see that part of the unmet need in our subpopulation? And the standard of care is important because as we come onto our definition of value at the end of this talk, it's really important to understand what is that gap between how people are currently treated and what we feel our therapy will actually benefit them, because that's the delta that we're going to determine is the value that we brought to that patient. And the standard of care will vary throughout the world. So it's very important when we're thinking of the value construct, capturing that value, that we recognize that standard of care varies and that we have the ability to scale our interventions and where we think the value is dependent on the healthcare system in which they exist. So the third level of analysis is the healthcare system and how is the delivery set up? Is it set up as a national HTA, such as NICE in the UK, or is it private pay, such as the US, or is it actually consumer retail pay, such as Brazil? So that's the third level of our analysis. So the heart is the unmet need, stratified. What is the standard of care? And what is the healthcare system? We use that framework then to really determine what does the clinical development program need to look like. Because we believe that the clinical development program will clearly contain placebo-controlled trials in order to gain registration, but there will be real-world evidence studies, there will be quality of life studies, there'll be other elements that we really wrap around our assessment in order to demonstrate the holistic value. Because in our view, value clearly is the offset medical need. It clearly is the change in the patient status from a quality of life. But we think increasingly we need to understand what is the societal benefit of the therapies we bring to market. So for example, in Alzheimer's disease, the medical offsets will be relatively small. They're often managed at home, managed by caregivers, managed by loved ones. But the societal burden of that disease is huge. And so taking those things into account is going to be critically important to truly understand value. And so we really reinforce continually in all of our interactions the societal benefit of what we do within the healthcare systems within which we anticipate to take that into account. Peter shared with you the historical view, and I certainly have lived through it in my time in the industry of, well, it's due to the high risk we undertake, it's due to the high cost of goods we undertake. We believe both of those are dangerous paradigms to base our value on. We think it has to be clinical outcome. And so our definition at Baxalta is the value we offer is basically the outcomes minus the costs. The other key element to take into account there is we recognize there is a delta, a variance in our treatments. Not everybody will have the same response, and that's what leads us to believe that risk sharing, managed entry agreements, volume cap guarantees, that we don't see a single price. We see a value within which, given the fact there will be variability in the clinical outcome, we will need to be prepared to enter various agreements to ensure that value is shared and value is proven. Now, I think the industry as a whole over the last few years has really said, yes, it is about value, it is about what we do for patients, it is about clinical offsets, it is about societal benefit, but that brings us into a whole host of new features that an industry we need to be prepared for. How do we measure value? And Peter walked you through some of those steps. Are we really capturing the ability to convert all of that value into utilities, to convert it into economic value? And then we get on to very thorny issues. What is the threshold? What is the threshold of value? Are there different thresholds for different patient populations? And do we think there's a difference of end of life? Do we think there's a difference for pediatric disease? These are all challenges that an industry that if we accept that value is our way forward, and we fundamentally believe, and I fundamentally believe it is, there's going to be many more things to tackle. How do we measure it? What is the threshold? Can we prove it? And doing that as an ecosystem, because I think as Katrine's going to take you through, I believe we're in the most important, exciting time in science, and we need to have the value process at the heart of what we do as much as the scientific process, because without it, we're not going to achieve the innovations that I think science is really offering us and we can offer to patients. So we really feel everything we do, yes, has to be around the science, yes, has to be around the patient, but it has to take into account the demonstration of that value in order to ensure that patients get access. With that, thanks very much. I'll hand over to Katrine.
So perhaps just a few thoughts from the perspective of someone who's been in the industry about 25 or so years now. And as I was thinking about this topic, it just made me reflect on the way in which this topic has come up over the years, sometimes with different language, but I think often really with the same fundamental question. Back in the mid-90s, when Bill Clinton was president, and there was the whole Healthcare Security Act. I actually bought a copy of that act. I have it somewhere in my library at home. I don't think I read it, but one of the interesting things about it wasn't even passed at that time, right? There was a lot of energy and dialogue around it, but there was no actual legislation passed. But it drove a tremendous dialogue within the industry, perhaps more on the managed care side of things than even in the pharmaceutical side of the industry, about how to drive costs out of the system. There's a couple years of my career where I worked in venture capital, and one of the things we invested in was healthcare service companies. And there was a huge number of opportunities as people were trying to experiment with new ways of delivering healthcare services that would be more efficient from a cost perspective. And one of the things in particular I remember from that time period was people experimenting with capitation models. Essentially, I'm going to give you this much money per member per month, and then I'll take care of all those healthcare costs. But they would do it, for example, for a disease. People are saying, could you capitate asthma? Could you capitate diabetes? Those are the two big ones. I'll take care of all the drug costs. I'll take care of all the monitoring. If I manage those better, asthmatics won't have their emergency room visits and so on and so forth. And so this was this great idea, right? We know if you manage patients with asthma better, they will have fewer exacerbations, better health, lower cost, good for everybody, right? Didn't work, right? There's a lot of experiments and it didn't work. And I think one of, it's a little bit of an echo of some of what we see today, which is how can you push a number of healthcare costs into a different payer environment, be it the push it into the cost of the drug and call it value delivered, or asking the drug company to take risk on the outcome instead of the health insurance company. Now, I'm not saying one or the other is the right answer per se, but this theme of where is the risk born for the fact that not every patient benefits the same for most medicines or for other healthcare services, right? It's not just about medicines. Medicines are a very easy target, which I'll touch on in a moment, but it is about where is the risk, the cost of the risk born in this system. The phrase we used to use in the industry all the time was pharmacoeconomics. I don't know if it means something different by saying value than when we said pharmacoeconomics, but at the end of the day, it was a phrase, and it's a discipline to say, what is the connection between the health benefit that your drug and your medicine provides, taking into account perhaps it has side effects or there are issues that also incur costs, and then the costs that you were able to avoid because you made the person healthier. So that's a discipline that's been around for, well, as long as I've been in the industry. So part of the reason I think this comes up is there are new technologies that drive the question in different ways. Certainly the field that I'm in, which is genomic medicines, the idea that you are delivering a therapeutic that then has a benefit much longer than the time of delivering the physical product, and how do the economics around that work? That's an interesting question. We actually have some interesting comparators. I mean, you look in other parts of the healthcare system, and the example that often comes to mind is bone marrow transplant. That's interesting. It's an expensive procedure, single-time procedure with a goal that has a long-term benefit. I think a key difference between those sorts of comparisons, though, is that the marginal cost of a drug or a therapy is quite small, right? It's in the vial. The real costs are the sunk costs. The marginal cost of a bone marrow transplant is much different. That's all about the operating room and the procedures and the people and all those other things that drive the total cost of a procedure like that. So it is somewhat apples and oranges, but we do have ways to think about how do you pay for therapies where your time of delivery is not contiguous with the time of benefit for the patient. As I think about it in the biggest picture, though, there's thinking through whether it was the 90s and capitation or pharmacoeconomics or all these different ways of thinking about cost and value of healthcare. There is this tension between healthcare costs, which are that is a real issue, right? We all know the numbers and how much they're rising and what they are in this country versus other countries, and where governments do or don't have a larger role in managing those costs, in tension with the imperative to innovate. And I think we can also look at the numbers and say that probably the way it works right now is that the way that we spend money on innovation in this country is helping to subsidize innovation that the whole world benefits from. Because if you're making a drug, you make the drug to try to treat patients wherever they may be. It's not really geographically specific. You need to take into account specific healthcare practices, but you really are hoping to treat all the patients wherever in the world they may reside. And the industry economic models are built to take that into account. We don't assume that every country is going to pay at the same rate. So how do you, in a country-by-country basis where you're trying to manage your healthcare costs, which is a big driver here, take into account that different countries are actually going to subsidize differential portions of innovation for the world overall. And if you look at probably the most compelling example recently is hepatitis C, one of the most spectacular achievements of this industry, right? It's cured. I mean, you can cure it with a 12-week course of therapy that has extremely high % response rate, very well tolerated, one pill. I mean, it's astonishing, and the speed with which and the competitiveness of the industry drove that. There's this dynamic of every 6 months there was another liver meeting, right? It was the EASL meeting in Europe and then the liver meeting here. It's literally called the liver meeting. Every 6 months where new data would come out, and because the trials were short, every 6 months there was more data and the next molecule and the profound competitiveness of it. It was spectacular scientifically, and as you saw, every 6 months people's aspiration of what they could do for patients went up. Higher % response rate, shorter duration of treatment, one pill, not multiple, no difficult side effects. And yet and you look at the economic benefit to the healthcare system, it's spectacular. I mean, the numbers are utterly compelling. And what made the headlines was the price of the drug. So somehow I think, and we as an industry, I think, have to own that we're not handling the dialogue well. And there are distractions, as we know, that through the fall, a lot of those who are somewhere associated with the industry who don't behave well and really don't have the same values, I think, that most of the innovative pharmaceutical companies have, who are trying to really take advantage of pricing. We have to deal with that too, but also where we really are delivering spectacular value to society and to patients who no longer will have the risk of liver transplant or no longer will have the risk of hepatocellular carcinoma. That is an incredible innovation for the world. Who pays for that is something that is a societal question, but also one that we should be proud of being able to achieve, delivering that kind of value. Thank you.
So let me see if I can weave together a couple themes to get you folks to maybe kind of respond to a little bit. And I think Peter and John, I'm going to go between yours, and then I will link to some of Katrine's comments here in a second. So, Peter, when you were describing, we have numerous frameworks that are emerging, and you gave 3 that I think were just in oncology between the Memorial Sloan Kettering ASCO and NCCN construct that's out there. And you also made a comment around the notion of value-based pricing was something you thought about, didn't have much confidence on, sounded like you were having more kind of coming back to maybe it has more potential relevance. But you usually think about markets, or you usually think about the ability to kind of you go to a market, you usually think about, you're not arguing about the unit of exchange, which in this case, you're talking about value. And John, you were talking about, even as you're thinking about the strategy and going through standard of care and thinking about what those unmet needs are, the health system context, the standard of care, recognizing that varies certainly across countries, but sometimes even within geographies within a country. And as you think about a contracting construct that you might be willing to go into, where there may be a risk element, it almost sounds like you were saying there's some bespoke qualities that might necessarily come to that in a way. So as you pull back from that for a moment, and I'm gonna go back to some of the R&D issues here in a moment, but as you kind of pull back from that in a moment, you've got something here where it clearly sounds very early. The fact that you as a strategist and something are putting in this place sounds like you believe that if nothing else you need to have this information, this insight, but it sounds like this may be where you think some markets are going. How do you actually practically begin putting into place a strategy and approach a bit more systematically, recognizing not all systems, not all areas are open to it, but where that is there, it may be a better model to assure you can capture that value. But with all the lack of definition we currently have out there, what do you think needs to be kind of put in place, or how do we make a contribution to shape it in a way that's the way we want to be operating in? responsibly, though, as well, clearly.
Well, thank you for starting with an easy question. So,
I was just aware of the time.
yeah, I mean, this is, of course, going to be extremely challenging, and the markets in healthcare notoriously are filled, as economists say, with imperfections. And, but I think I'd make a few comments. One, I do think these value frameworks that are emerging are welcome. In a sense, I think they're irreversible. I think they're here to stay. They're not going away. But I do think we're in early stages of experimentation and evolution. So I think we will, over time, see different kinds of frameworks and measurement techniques and so forth. So, I think the industry can play a constructive role in helping to shape those. But, this is a journey we're on, and it's going to take some time, and there's going to be a lot of challenges doing it. Let me also talk about innovative contracting, and I think some of your comments were about that. And I made a comment that was pessimistic in the past. I think we have, in a sense, overstated our ability, or have been overconfident in our ability, our collectively ability to do innovative contracting. If you go back, even to the mid-2000s, certainly the later part of that decade, there was a lot of discussion, conferences, papers about risk-sharing agreements, outcomes-based agreements, and at least in the US, we really haven't seen very many successful ones. And I think there are reasons for that. They're very hard to do. You're asking industry and payers to enter into a contractual agreement about a future outcome in a real-world environment with non-randomized patients subject to the vagaries of physician prescribing and patient behavior and lack of data systems and so forth. I think it's turned out very hard to actually do that well. And when companies have tried to do it, they have, in a sense, devolved to clever discounting. They've discounted, not entered into these really performance-based agreements. Now, the question is, are we at a different place today? And there's a statement, I don't know, it comes out of Silicon Valley or someplace, that we overestimate, in terms of innovation, we tend to overestimate what we can do in 3 years, but we underestimate what we can do in 10 years. And there may be something like that going on here, that, in 10 years from now, say, we will have figured out how to pay based on outcomes. Why? We'll have better biomarkers tied to hard endpoints. We'll have better data systems. We'll have better abilities to track patients in real time. We'll have all kinds of data capture we don't have today, and we'll be able to actually pay for realized outcomes. Now, we have an example with the PCSK9s and Harvard Pilgrim here. We seem to have examples now with heart failure and Novartis. There's a lot of discussions about other products where we'll have outcomes-based agreements. So, I think there's more reason to be optimistic. And the final thing I'll say, when I give this talk about how hard it is to do value-based contracting, the other thing I say is, well, if Uber can figure out how to get a card to me in 3 minutes, or fill in the blank of your favorite app, you would think that this is certainly achievable. And with our great minds around the table, around the room here and elsewhere, I think we can make good progress on this. But again, I think this is a journey.
Thanks, Peter. To share my perspective on this, I think the key thing to me in terms of the contracting is there are many policy issues in the way of contracting, particularly in the United States. So best price and other things has made these things much more difficult than they would need to be. And I think I see a willingness that some of those things, one, will change, but they will change slowly, but they definitely will change. So I think there's opportunity there. The other thing, I gave a talk here a few months ago to the Harvard Alum Medical Society, and I was asked the question, what do I think is the most important biomarker that's going to emerge in the following 5 years? So another easy question. And my answer to that question is, the biomarker that's going to appear is the electronic medical record and the data capture that goes with it. And that in itself will truly enable many of these things. And I think that revolution in really what the true outcomes are, the utilization and other things that becomes more sustainable, will enable this as well. Going back to the start of Jeff's question, my own view is we need to take into account value frameworks. It doesn't mean that we will like them or we don't like them, but if we don't understand how to derive value, we will always be in a weaker position because people will fill that space. Many people will then argue, well, is the value in framework right? What I would say, as Jeff said in his introduction about the difference between our industry and other industries, is that people choose what they pay. They choose to determine, is the value of the watch from Switzerland, or am I happy with the watch from Singapore? And they make that choice. People with health issues don't make the choice. And so we as an industry, I think, have an obligation that we need to be able to demonstrate the value. I'm happy to be in a position to disagree with the framework or disagree with the threshold, but I do feel that we have an obligation to explain what our value is. And so I think when you're thinking through your clinical development program, understanding the utilities, understanding where you expect the value to be derived from is a critical component of clinical development moving forward.
Right. So, Katrina, let me let you respond to the same question, but I want to add maybe, I want to go back to some of your comments here, because you were almost describing an evolution of ways we've tried to do this in the past. They didn't really work out that well.
Different names we've called it.
And the different names we've called it, but even when we were doing capitation or there was managed care, different organizations had different models, and they asked the clinicians to treat the next patient differently depending upon who their managed care company was. And we actually learned that we can't have different processes around different patients within the same kind of health system. So there were a lot of reasons why they failed. But as you start thinking about, we do have therapies now that will produce decades of benefit, which some of the kind of genetically targeted and gene therapy will. And you made a comment that we may not have adequate ways of accommodating that in terms of how we think about paying, funding, or otherwise doing that. How do you think we should think of it? Because if you think about the pipeline now, this is going to become a much more relevant question of interest.
Yeah, well, I mean, we have plenty of examples of therapies that already face this conundrum, and in a word, antibiotics. Right? And we basically completely drove innovation out of antibiotics because they were all driven to generic prices. There are some other challenges there too in terms of physician behavior and wanting to reserve new antibiotics and all that, which is a separate kind of challenge to address. But if you think about a curative therapy, man, nothing's more at the top of the list of that. Well, vaccines, actually. I would put vaccines even above that. We expect to pay very little for vaccines, and yet the health benefit is probably more spectacular, more lives saved through vaccines than anything else that has been innovative in medicine. Antibiotics probably second on the list. And both of those are very, very, very inexpensive. So, how do you, when innovation is important to human health, in those areas where we pay the least, we get the least innovation. Now, there are some companies that remain very committed. You look at another spectacular medicine, Merck's HSV vaccine. HPV vaccine, I should say. Spectacular medicine. The data are amazing. The reasons that it's challenges, social issues perhaps more. But even with the low rates of vaccination, as they start to do their real-world follow-up, incredible benefits from that. So, I think it is wonderful that there are still companies that remain committed to these areas that are less economically beneficial. But you also see large companies gravitating towards those, putting more R&D effort towards those areas where they think there's more economic benefit. Certainly there's a lot of unmet need in those areas, the rare diseases and such, but you don't want the innovation to be limited to those areas where there seems to be economic benefit. I think you mentioned Alzheimer's, I think, is an excellent example, and I think one of you was talking about the fact that the costs associated with Alzheimer's are largely untabulated, right? It is, and there may well be a gender dimension to this too, because the caregivers tend to be female, they tend to be family members, and a lot of the cost of the care of Alzheimer's is, so it's implicit either in the family structure, or it's unreimbursed, or it's an opportunity cost that person is not contributing economically some other way. And so aside from the deep personal health tragedies for those individuals and for those families, showing what the economic benefit is of a medicine that really helps a patient with Alzheimer's is going to face a very difficult kind of challenge. And yet, particularly given how prevalent that particular disease is, I'm willing to wager that 80% of the people in this room either have a friend or a family member or a loved one or a friend of a friend who suffers from this. We know how bad these diseases can be, and so I don't think that it's, I don't think that people say, leave it as it is. We don't want to add cost to the system because, you know, that would just make the healthcare more expensive. I don't think anybody thinks that. But if we have a successful Alzheimer's medicine, it will become a very big topic very fast.
Yeah. I think building on that point, Katrine, that's why it's important that we as an industry have a role in the frameworks. Because if you, depending on your view of the world and what you see, I think a framework that we would be interested in would take into account that societal cost and societal benefit. If you're an insurance company where you're just looking at direct medical offsets, you would have a very different framework. And that's why I think the frameworks we need to be involved in.
I guess, John, your last comment is actually where I wanted to kind of sort of move, because, and you made a comment about, you know, what's the biomarker, and we have data, and what the biomarker being an electronic medical record. And one of the reasons why I can't imagine how somebody could ever have cleared any kind of value or outcomes contract if they couldn't measure it. And in fact, I mean, you know, the ambiguity. And I think we now have a, you know, new FDA head who actually has made comments about how do I make trial designs more real-world-like. Because right now, I have several clients that I work with that basically say they're trying to validate in the real-world data that the trial outcomes held up because the context of the trial wasn't like how a patient gets stratified in actual clinical practice. Right. And so therefore, they need to show that, and actually when they did that, they actually revealed there are better responders actually in the real world population than we saw in the trial data, but that wasn't generally recognized. So how do I do that? And then there were some adverse responders where they could do mitigation strategies against that response and improve the outcomes as well, mainly because the data were now available to kind of do that. So if you think about this, how do we shape it to be what we want? Because I actually sort of, this notion, because I think there's gaps. You're talking about value, and again, our own research says a lot of the things that influence value is not within the four walls of a provider entity where that prescribing activity or administration activity actually kind of took place. So how do you bridge that? I mean, what's the catalyst for bridging that? Particularly if we're going to be held accountable for value, right?
Right. So I think I think it starts certainly from our premise that it starts with defining who the patient population is, and separating out what do you need to prove in order that the product is safe, versus where is the product efficacious. The second level of efficacy is then effectiveness, and this again is where I think, based on what we understand of the disease and the burdens, the clinical trial design is critically important. The best current example I can share with you is, if you run a clinical trial in obesity, you know that the FDA require you to actually have a behavioral intervention in parallel. Now, at the start of that process, the industry was not too comfortable with that because they felt they would get a greater weight loss without the behavioral program in terms of the delta between the drug and the untreated. However, what we understand about that since is that, in fact, the very adherence that the behavioral education program requires actually leads to better long-term outcomes for the people who actually stay with the product and the program. Irrespective of which drug it is, the combination of those two things leads to better overall outcomes. So I don't know if I'm going to answer your question well, but I think it is being very clear on who and not everyone, and then making sure that we understand, in whichever way your individual company thinks about it, what is the burden to the patient, not just in terms of their disease, but that patient journey and what it takes to cope with their life, and what things will actually enable them to move from efficacy into effectiveness, and then being able to document that to the benefit of the different payers and providers that we interact with around the world. That's at least how I think about it, Jeff.
Actually, if I might, as I said, I might add just a little bit too. I think that, particularly in the world of genetic diseases, a lot of times one of the things you need to do is to understand the natural history of the disease, because they're often not well studied or understood. And so part of figuring out your clinical development is understanding in a very objective way that natural history of the disease. I think there's also what I sometimes call the economic natural history of the disease, and how do you understand the associated costs, and understanding those costs is an important part of understanding the value that you're going to deliver, as well as what would be meaningful to that patient, what would be meaningful to the caregivers for that patient. That definition of value may be different from what a regulator or a clinician might assume the value would be. And so how do you also bring the patient into the definition of value, because if their life has been improved in a way that's meaningful to them, and that ultimately that's what regulators are really focused on. Is it going to make the patient's life better? I don't care what happened to their blood chemistries. Is their patient better? And so for these diseases that are not, or there isn't a path defined of clinical development endpoints and such, defining those meaningful endpoints, what is valued by the patient, and then I think also weaving in that understanding of the economic natural history of the disease. You have to do both of those things.
Yeah, I would agree. I just add a few things. One, the idea that a lot of the innovation that's important and it's happening and it's relevant to everyone here is in the data sciences, not only the biological sciences. And it's the epidemiology, the predictive modeling, the analytics that we're able to do. You may know Vinod Khosla is a billionaire entrepreneur in California. He likes to say data scientists over the next generation will be more important to improving health than biological scientists. It's a kind of a provocative, probably not provable statement, but he also says, by the way, in 10 years he'd rather be treated by his mathematician than his physician. So the idea being the mathematician will really understand the course of the disease and the probabilities of cures and all kinds of things much better than the practicing physician. But I think the point is these innovations in data are very, very critical and real and relevant. But the other point is in terms of evidence and measurement, I think there's all kinds of work that has to be done. So we could tell good stories about, and I think they're probably valid, about Alzheimer's patients and caregivers and a potential disease-modifying agent for Alzheimer's having impacts on caregivers, for example. The new treatment for depression having impacts on productivity in the workplace and so forth. But those are evidence questions ultimately. It's not just telling a story. And I think that's going to be the critical part of this value future, that we need to measure and convince and bring data to bear to really show that the interventions have impacts broader than just the direct medical ones we tend to think about.
By the way, if I could add, I think Vinod Khosla may be getting more interested in biology. He was an investor in my last private round. I had very interesting conversations with him about this.
So he's hedging his bets.
Well, at least he thinks biology matters. So.
Are you also investing in data scientists? Are you?
Yeah.
So just to reinforce a little bit, actually, if you apply analytics to data sets for rare diseases, you find there's a predictable pattern to even misdiagnosis, because you find the process of trying to figure out what it is oftentimes gives you insights into what, where those failure points give you insight to what it should be, and you can actually collapse the time to appropriate diagnosis. And unfortunately, we have seen in oncology, certain of the cognitive processing tools do seem to get to an accurate diagnosis faster than a human being in some of those contexts too. So I mean, just to kind of reinforce that area. I want to talk about the commercial model here for a moment, because you described something, and I think, John, as I'm listening to you, I had a hospital or a large health system say when they were going into a value-based contract with a company that you named that it's a business-to-business process. It was no longer a kind of an individual who was representing the interests, but it really was a committee that was able to sit down, describe a disease area, describe the contracting model, and what else would need to be deployed, whether it was education, remote monitoring, or whatever it was, to actually get to the targeted outcome. And it was almost felt like they were putting into place a collaboration agreement more than they were actually contracting a product sale, if you will, around that. How do you see, and that struck me that the current aspects of the commercial model, that's quite dissimilar than the way we normally organize and operate. How do you think about that, see that might evolve?
I think it's evolving with the system that we're really talking about. Katrine very eloquently shared that journey. I was also old enough to understand and study pharmacoeconomics, which no longer exists. It's now health economics, so I already realize I'm a dinosaur. It is really, that change is really the evolution of that decisions are made by individuals versus decisions are a collective piece. And I think what will happen in the future, I think it really will be about that collaborative piece where people will understand the burden of illness, they'll understand which patients are we talking about that meet that there is a series of offerings that wrap around to drive effectiveness. But it will be the enabling of the whole system that makes that happen. It will not be or would be much less so the decision of an individual for an individual product.
Okay.
And I think that changes. We see it in our industry where it moves away from single sales representatives and physicians, but to be account managers who understand the benefit of the provider, sales representatives who understand the physicians, MSLs who understand the science, patient advocacy who understands the needs of the patients, and everyone coming together to drive effectiveness for those patients and not simple efficacy from a phase 3 double-blind placebo-controlled trial.
So I think we're getting to close, but let me offer both, maybe Katrina, if you had to sort of guide us to, I mean, you've seen MassBio here has a focus on value in its 2020 plan strategy, also has policy and advocacy as one of its central sort of functions that's here. And I think part of this is the role of this organization is to create a context where innovation can continue to address the highest unmet needs of patients. Where do you, particularly even if it's for your current company in operation, where do you think some of those, even if it was a long-term, long-sighted view, where should we direct some of that? That it's actually to sort of structurally help address some of those things that might better support it.
I mean, structurally, it's going to be very different country by country, but I think that, what we, obviously I'm a CEO of quite a young company, and a lot of what I think about is how do I translate the very new and young science that we're working on into medicines, and that is a Herculean proposition, an extremely exciting one. But I think every single disease we're working on, there are no or very few or very poor therapies. And so every single disease that we're working on, we have to not only innovate around the molecules that we're developing, but what's the clinical development path, what's the regulatory path, how would it be approved, as well as the economic model. So we have to solve every single dimension of those challenges. And I wish I could tell you I have the answers. You'd think in a 270-page S1 it would be in there somewhere, but it is actually the journey that we are on. And I think what the fundamental core of all of that is that if you are really, we all talk about the word value. What is valuable to a patient? If you're treating a disease in a meaningful way, not a marginal, statistical, but does it change their life? Maybe not, but in a really meaningful way. And you're engaging along the way with payers. I think that's an important part. You can't leave it to the end. It has to be part of the journey of drug development. And so that by the time you get to having enough data to say this is a medicine that should be approved, you already have a very rich and deep conversation with the people who own the economic parts of this and make them a part of that dialogue along the path.
Maybe I could just add to Katrina. I think I want to link my comment to one of Katrina's opening comments. I think one of the key things that could be changed that would make a huge difference would be to change the statement around what is truthful and not misleading. I think that would enable two things to happen. One is it would enable us as an industry to give advice about which is the treatment population, and so avoid this perception or the actual issue that the company couldn't communicate how many people would benefit from Hep C treatment, but could give people that advance notice so they could plan and take that into account. And the second part of changing that truthful and not misleading would be the ability to talk about economic data and the translation of that, which is much broader than the placebo-controlled trials that law currently addresses. So I think that's one change in policy and legislation that could make a difference to our industry and enable us to get more into a dialogue around what we need to do.
Right.
I guess I just close by saying I think these are exciting times. There's a lot of unmet need that people here are helping to address. The science is very exciting. MassBio and again, people around this room I think are part of a great process here. But if we want to command, or if people here want to command premium prices, we're going to have to demonstrate value. And again, a whole series of measurement, analytic issues around that. I think we need to take a broad view of value over time across caregivers and on. But ultimately, those are going to be evidence questions. And so I think these value issues have to permeate every aspect of the companies, and I think that's our challenge.
So I think my personal view coming away from some of this is I think this move towards health provider systems taking a larger role actually in overall health is actually positive for us, because I think actually we're not distancing the financial decision from the clinical decision, and if they feel they have a long-term view on actually benefiting that, I actually think on net that actually bodes well. The amount of data, I mean, we actually, the work, you can look and determine and measure something today that even 3 years ago was very difficult to do. And that ability will get stronger, and oftentimes people have ambiguity even around what was the level of unmet need. I don't think we'll have that ambiguity. Actually, I think you're going to have greater transparency and visibility. I think that's very good. Then it really is about solving that problem, not is it actually worth solving. Actually, it's going to be evident that's there. So for me, I think the nature of kind of having the data and the information and connecting it more to a longer term perspective as opposed to a current operating year perspective, I think actually bodes more positive. It's not going to be an easy process, and it's actually going to have a lot of differentiated systems. But I do think collectively this is very awkward, and it's very difficult for health provider systems, for health authorities, and I think we need to help shape up what some of those models and approaches look like through our own efforts and initiatives and policy work, et cetera. But I really want to I think it's one of the toughest topics. It's one of the most important. I want to really thank you for your thoughts and kind of putting it forward and for bringing it here to the forum today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff.